one thing that really jumped out to me about your presentation is you're talking about some of these technologies that we have, like the continuous glucose monitors and constant insulin monitoring and insulin pumps and all these amazing things. Yet the targets that we have for normal people with type 1 diabetes are embarrassingly high. They're way outside the range that you're talking about as far as where we need to control glucose. And again, the thing that stood out for me on your presentation was, with all of these technologies, why are we not seeing improvements? Yet when we focus on something even more simple like the diet, it seems like we're seeing amazing improvements in health and lifespan and all these amazing things. Like, how do you reconcile those facts?
So that question actually goes back over 100 years, where nutrition was the mainstay intervention to prolong the life of a patient who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes before insulin was discovered. We actually wrote an article with Belinda Leonards and David Loeb at Boston Children's and Harvard Med describing this century-old concept, where actually it was standard of care for people with type 2 diabetes and obesity in the 1700s. If you look at historical books, actually catalog nutrition in the context of diabetes. But when you start talking about the evolution of what diet should be recommended or the impact of diet in general, it's a very unique story, because in the context of type 1 diabetes, you're this unique, what I call insulin knockout model, where you don't produce insulin, you have to administer it on your own. So you have complete control over your insulin, okay? And as a result, you can then see how food, exercise, sleep, all these different components ultimately change glucose while having total control over the amount of insulin you administer. So for an example, what does that mean? So let's say that one day I wake up and I was, let's say today, Casey, I take 2 units of insulin for a set meal of a certain amount of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And then over the next month, I happen to gain like 5-10 pounds. Who knows why the reason was, but I just did. That same meal, all other factors controlled, I'm now taking 4 units of insulin. And so, where someone else may not realize that, oh man, my insulin requirements are going up because I'm becoming less insulin sensitive. That in the context of type 1 diabetes, you gain direct access to that type of information. And if you have the advanced knowledge about the impact insulin can have and insulin resistance can have, you can now translate the potential long-term health implications of these subtle changes in lifestyle. That's just one example. But when you start talking about the impact of nutrition, so you're alluding at something that I think is not fully accepted, Casey. The idea that nutrition has a potent impact, there is emergent evidence that it could be, if it or frankly is, the most potent lifestyle factor in regulating glucose control. And I would argue that that spans beyond just type 1 diabetes. But what you see in type 1 diabetes is the full, clear, unencumbered resolution on the true potency of nutrition has on a day, basically a meal by meal basis. So we know that in the context of food, carbohydrates has the most potent impact on glucose. So postprandial, when you eat carbohydrates, particularly starchy, sugary carbohydrates, you see a very rapid spike, and ultimately it should come down in the presence of insulin over time. Now, what's different in type 1 diabetes is that people with type 1 diabetes, because of the lack of endogenous insulin production, we have to administer insulin exogenously. And it's a bit slower. The fastest acting insulins in exogenous form are about 3 to 4-fold slower than what happens for someone like yourself, Casey, assuming you don't have type 1 diabetes. And so it's delayed. And so, and beyond that, beyond the delay in insulin to be able to manage very rapid acting glycemically impactful foods like carbohydrates, is the fact that in type 1 diabetes, the absence of endogenous insulin also causes an elevation of something called glucagon. We know that glucagon is actually elevated not only at basal levels in people with type 1, but postprandial. So that means that every single meal, there is a hyper response to food in type 1. So in type 1 diabetes, it really gives you the best insight over, and I would argue, any other disease on the potency of nutrition in managing metabolic health. We also know in the context of type 1 diabetes, we've learned more about the impact of glycemic control than any other disease. In fact, our appreciation for the negative impact of glucose comes from type 1 diabetes, not type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is where we've learned that independent of weight, independent of elevated body weight, elevated adiposity levels, elevated lipid levels, usually normal weight individuals, just the absence of insulin in the body and elevated and variable glucose levels, so essentially just elevated and variable glucose levels, drives increased risk for alternative leading causes of death, about a 10-fold higher increased risk for heart disease or macrovascular disease, and then ultimately an expectation that every patient is expected to have at least one long-term complication in their lifetime, with an 11 to 18-year shortened life expectancy. And the leading risk factor for all of these in type 1 diabetes is glucose control. So in the context of type 1 diabetes, we have learned more about the impact of glucose in long-term health than any other disease out there. In fact, this is the foundation of where that has been discovered, and then translated outside of it where it is relevant to other people. But we have conducted studies because there was this on the impact of carbohydrates. And the reason we were so fascinated about this, besides the idea that we know that carbohydrates have the most potent impact on postprandial glycemic control, and it is the most potent lifestyle factor on glycemic management in a dose-dependent manner. So the more you consume, the higher glucose levels go post-consumption, is that we also knew that when people were starting to restrict carbohydrates, that they seemed to have improvements in glycemic control. However, a lot of the evidence on this was very spotty, meaning that it was case reports or maybe an observation over here or over there, and there wasn't this really robust, what people expect to see is called randomized controlled trial style evidence. And there's value to that discussion about why randomized controlled trials are so important or not, but not to get too much into the weeds. What our team did, and a part of what I presented at the Metabolic Health Symposium, which is getting to the final stretch here, and hopefully will be published soon, is we gathered and consolidated every single study in the context of type 1 diabetes, this unique disease where you have total control and observation of glucose and insulin 24/7, and looked at every study that ever published with a confirmed patient with type 1 diabetes, a confirmed time on a set amount of carbohydrates, and a disease biomarker that resulted from that time on carbohydrates. And we pulled every single study. We reviewed over 8,000 articles. This has been a multi-year process, and ultimately came down to do what we do is these large cross-study analysis called meta-regressions and systematic reviews. And that included around 46,000 patients with type 1 diabetes, looking across studies on the impact of carbohydrates have on things like HbA1c, which is a long-term measure of glucose control, or total insulin load, which is a surrogate marker for insulin sensitivity or resistance, and other things like blood lipids. And what we found is that carbohydrates, when you go from the average intake of carbohydrates in type 1 diabetes, which is around what the general population is, which is 45% of your total calories coming from carbohydrates, that if you start consuming more carbohydrates than that, which some people recommend, like, okay, consume less fat, consume more carbs, you see no improvement in things like HbA1c or insulin from going from the average intake to even higher carbs. Because in essence, what you're doing is you're also, by default, almost certainly reducing fat intake when you increase carbs. Protein is usually relatively stable. And then when you go from that average intake down, however, there is a unique statistical phenomenon where there is a clear, significant impact on reducing carbohydrate intake all the way down to hypothetical zero in a dose-dependent manner. And what's interesting about this, Casey, is that almost no study, only 10% of high carbohydrate diet studies showed that patients were able to hit the American Diabetes Association target of less than 7% HbA1c. When you got to moderate carbohydrate, so a slight reduction in carbohydrate from just the norm, you see around 20% of 20% of studies observed hitting this target. When you got to low carbohydrate, and this isn't even this very low carbohydrate ketogenic, it's just somewhere between 50 to 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. Not the very low end, but kind of lower than what most people are consuming, over 70% of those studies showed hitting the target, and 100% of a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet hit those targets. And we can uncover the why we're actually talking about 7%, which is not even close to normal, and why those are set. And then we can dive in it. But in essence, to say that this is the largest study ever conducted, which consolidated all the evidence in the context of this disease, which is a very unique disease for insight on metabolic health, and show that carbohydrates had a dose-dependent response on key measures of long-term health and disease risk, like HbA1c, insulin load. But it didn't have any negative impact on blood lipids, which was kind of shocking because you would not expect that on a patient-by-patient basis or outside of the disease of type 1 diabetes. But we didn't see any negative impacts on lipids from carbohydrate restriction when looking at the observation of all these studies combined. So it really lent itself to illustrate that nutrition is arguably one of the most potent potential levers you can pull in regulating disease outcomes in a disease like type 1 diabetes, where food is so intimately linked to the day-to-day management of the disease, specifically through glycemic control and insulin, but also that has long-term implications on risk over the lifespan, which is quite consequential.